This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Welcome to the OI podcast, the Otago Institute podcast, in-depth conversations with experts from the worlds of arts, sciences and Mātauranga Māori, brought to you by the Otago Institute, the Otago branch of the Royal Society for Arts and Sciences. Kia ora, I'm Dr Barb, and today we have a special episode out there because the Royal Society itself, Te Aparangi, has just had the annual Research Honours Awards, and the first tier of these, the first 5 medals awarded, were here in Ōtepoti, Dunedin, and we were lucky enough to grab a couple of the winners of the medals the day after the awards ceremony and interview them here in the studio. So I've got them live here coming up as they were the day after the ceremony. So this was recorded on the 15th of November. Today we're super privileged to have in the studio Peter Heenan, Dr Peter Heenan. And Peter Heenan was at the Research Awards for the Royal Society New Zealand, the National Awards, Te Aparangi, last night, and was awarded the 2024 Leonard Cockayne Lecture Award for commemorates the life and work of a great New Zealand botanist. And I was just saying to Peter before the interview, it confuses me, this sentence, because are we talking about the life and work of the great Leonard Cockayne or the botanist who's being awarded the award, or both together? And I think it's absolutely, as Peter says, we'll just add a little S on the end of it. Anyway, welcome to the studio, Peter, and thank you so much for coming along first thing this morning after what must have been a really big night last night.
Yes, good morning, Barb, and thanks for the invitation to do the podcast. Look, it was a really good night last night, and I was raised in Dunedin, so and my mother and my father, who's passed away, they are from Dunedin, so it was quite good coming back last night. So my roots, I guess, are in Dunedin.
It's always nice to return home to Dunedin.
Yeah, it is. But it was a really good night last night. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and although a lot of colleagues couldn't come because people I work with are back at Lincoln or Christchurch or elsewhere around New Zealand.
David Whitehead was there, though.
Yeah, David was there from Landcare Research, our former chief scientist, and there was a few people locally that I caught up with, Neil Gemmell and Nigel Perry as well. Yeah. So Nigel I've done a little bit of work with over the years. So It was good to see a few familiar faces. Yeah,
fantastic, eh? And it was a fantastic night. I'll just go through a little bit of your background here. Peter has a decades-long commitment to Aotearoa's rich botany and shared his knowledge with audiences across Aotearoa New Zealand and the world. Peter is described as having an unrivalled knowledge of Aotearoa New Zealand's flora and the institutions responsible for botanical research. You began life as a horticulturist for the DSIR, is that right?
Well, it was actually the Dunedin City Council.
Oh, Dunedin City Council to start with, of course.
So, because I left school in the late 70s, and then I got a horticultural apprenticeship with the Dunedin City Council in the Botanic Gardens. So that was like a 4-year apprenticeship in those days.
Wow. I mean, that must have been amazing, really, working in the botanical...
Yeah, no, it was pretty good. What actually happened was a couple of things happened, one of which my mother reminded me last night was that one day when I was at high school at Otago Boys, I came home and I must have had some discussion or some pressure or something that I would go to Otago University. The problem was my father was an academic in the geography department, and I was interested in plant biogeography. It was probably what I would have done. Yeah. So I wasn't, as a rebellious teenager, going to go into the same department my father was an academic in. So I sort of had to do something a little bit different, and so...
Isn't that funny? And then you found a whole other route to being an academic.
Yeah, I went another route. Yeah, so the early horticultural training when I left school. The other thing that happened was in my sixth form. So I left at the end of sixth form.
Yeah, which is year 12 now.
Year 12 now. Yeah. So during the holidays in that year, my father had made arrangements, and actually what happened now, it's just coming back to me, I did work on the ground staff of Otago University as a student when I was at high school.
Right.
So
Goodness.
my father arranged for that,
Yeah.
and so that was sort of my first exposure to horticultural type work.
And I guess Jeff Bayliss must have been the head of department.
He was then, yeah. So
the botany
but-
department then,
Yeah, he was certainly around then, that's right. But that work with the university was more with the garden staff who did the
Right.
maintenance of the gardens around the entire campus. And then I really enjoyed that. And
I only mention that because I know Jeff Bayliss from the botany department had quite an input into the plantings around, like
Right.
what was being planted, not maintaining them. That was
yeah,
obviously
yes.
operations and governance.
Yeah, no, that's right. No, I once went to Jeff's garden up on High Street.
Oh, it was fantastic,
many
wasn't it?
years
Yeah.
ago with the big house there, but that's a separate story.
Yeah.
But and I really enjoyed that horticultural work at the university. So then I can't remember how, but I think my father must have made a few inquiries, and they had these apprenticeships. And what happened was, if you worked in the gardens for as a volunteer in your school holidays, which is what I went and did, and if you enjoyed it and got on well with everything and enjoyed the people, the work, etc., and then you applied for an apprenticeship, you sort of had your foot in the door a bit because they knew you. So
Right.
I did that over, I think, a couple of the term holidays in that, sixth form year, 12 year.
Yeah.
And then, I ended up there for 4 years. And we used to get moved around to different parts of this, the parks department as it was. So it wasn't all in the Botanic Gardens. Probably about half of it was in the gardens and the rest of it was doing other things.
Was some of it growing the plants to go in the other planted
Oh yeah, no.
places
So
around
there
town?
was two nurseries. There was the main nursery, propagation nursery in the Botanic Gardens, and
Right.
what we called the top gardens.
Yeah, so,
And-
I mean that's been developed, but I think that was always up on.
It's up on
Lovelock
the
Lovelock
that's right. There's a
Avenue.
potting
Yeah.
shed, and there was admin and other offices up
Yeah.
there. And then they produced plants for around the Botanic Gardens and also the glass houses and the lower gardens.
Right.
But then there was a tree nursery up in near Ross Creek.
Oh right.
So that grew big trees.
Wow.
And so we used to have placements up there as well.
Oh, I didn't realise
So
that.
you used to get moved around. So that horticultural side of it was pretty interesting, actually.
Yeah, and probably invaluable experience for later on.
Oh, what happened was that I think in my third year of that apprenticeship, or maybe even earlier, it must have been the second year actually, I decided that I wanted to specialise in native plants
Right.
as a sort of a thing. So, and I had all the books of the time, Laurie Metcalf's cultivation books. I got the key New Zealand books of the time, volume one of the
floras,
Flora and all that sort of stuff. So I was lapping all that up, and then I ran across actually some of Leonard Cockayne's writings way back then. And one of his books, I think it was New Zealand Plants and Their Story, he said, if you want to grow New Zealand plants, you really need to go into the bush and see them.
Yeah.
So I at high school, I played football and cricket and volleyball and stuff. Never to a super high level, but enjoyed what I was doing and to the best of my abilities at the time. But I took up tramping.
Right.
Joined the Otago Tramping and Mountaineering Club.
Of course, as all good Otago University students do.
So, but that was to sort of follow Leonard Cockayne's advice.
Right.
And so I wanted to join the dots on what the plants were doing in the wild, because up to that point I'd never really been in the bush. We had a lot of family holidays, but they weren't so much like tramps
Proper bush
or
tramping,
bush walking.
and then getting above tree line as well.
Yeah, so what happened was I started tramping, and through the tramping club, and we had a really good group of people there, and we were often away during that period, like 3 weekends out of 4 in a month type of thing.
Yeah.
We were constantly in the mountains in central and west Otago.
Yeah.
And I was like focused on the botany. I was often trailing down the back, because I was always looking at something. So anyway, then
the less fit amongst us quite often spy something of botanical interest every
is a good distraction.
every
yeah.
now and again. Yeah.
So, but then I took up mountaineering. It sort of morphed into mountaineering.
Ah, right.
So, and the attraction there was not so much that tramping got a bit boring, but I was always looking further up the valley or up the peaks,
Yeah.
and then of course there was the alpine plants.
Because that's that real diversification above tree line, isn't it? And
Yep. So during that time, I've done a lot of work on the alpine flora and the taxonomy and the evolution of the flora and the biogeography of it, and a lot of it I think stems from those early days when, particularly climbing above the tree line, had the opportunity to look at those plants.
Yeah.
So I guess that's sort of the formative years. So it was a really solid grounding in horticulture.
Yeah. And then you came to the DSIR, which is the precursor of land care research, Manaaki Whenua, and all the other CRIs.
Yes. So there was a little other step in there. I left. I went to Lincoln and did a diploma in Parks and Recreation.
Oh, right.
So that was as soon as I finished my apprenticeship, I went there. That was a 2-year diploma at the time. And one of the things in those days there was different options of that diploma. So I was doing the local authority option because I worked in local government.
Right.
But there were park rangers there, and I was by that time I was more. Had a better feeling and I can't think of the right word, but
sort of growing into what you were going for.
Yeah, better affinity with the park ranger side of it than I did with the local government side of it. So there was myself and one other lady who was there, Beth. She was also interested in that park side of it. So we, as well as doing our main coursework, we actually also picked up some park ranger courses as well around biodiversity and conservation, just to complement what we were doing.
Yeah.
So that was another sort of step in that biodiversity space. And then I had to come back to Dunedin for a year or so, a couple of years, because I was on study leave.
Right.
I had a city council grant to go.
Right.
And so I had to serve out my bond.
Oh, right. So it's like, they pay for you to do the diplomas and then you come back and kind of...
They basically covered the fees and that sort of thing. So, but then it was time to move on. So I went to Ashburton doing parks management. But I could see that if I was going to have a career in parks management, I wanted to be more competent.
Right.
So I actually left Ashburton after about a year and started, it seems bizarre now looking back on it, started an MBA at Canterbury.
Right.
So I had the business sort of nous and accounting and, financial management.
No, that makes sense,
and
because
planning.
if you're in management and parks management, then you have some business. Yeah.
But although I was doing pretty well in that course, I actually dropped out because I decided after about 4 months
that is not the way to go.
I do not want to be a manager for the rest of my life.
Fair enough.
And so a quick thing happened then. I had contacts at the Christchurch City Council. I got a job pruning street trees there for the winter with them, and then I ended up in the Botanic Gardens, and then the position became available at DSIR Botany Division as a technical officer.
Right.
So
technical officer, that's like in the lab?
So it wasn't so much in the lab, because at that point I only had horticultural skills. I didn't have any science in the parks diploma. I didn't really have a science background. So I took that role, and it was a mixture of tasks really, but I guess it was really to look after the grounds at the Canterbury Agricultural Science Centre, which is where out at Lincoln, Plant and Food, Ag-Research was there, Botany Division. It all became land care in the CRIs in '92. But my appetite was whetted by the botany, and so as quickly as I could, I found a way to do botany there. And so I applied for this scholarship called the J.R. Templin Travelling Scholarship, which allowed me to go to Missouri.
Right.
And I got a DSIR scholarship as well, so I could keep my salary, so to speak.
Wow.
Because at that point, I was newly married, and so,
just the idea of being paid a normal salary while you're studying to do a master's.
I just can't believe when you look at where it's all landed today. And
it's amazing, isn't it?
The support I had of people like Colin Webb in particular, at that time was a manager, and he fully supported me in doing what I did.
It's fantastic, really, isn't it? Because you got that apprenticeship to start with, and the kind of agreement to go and do those diplomas at Lincoln and Canterbury, and then come back here to sort of pay off that. But then you didn't have a debt that you were saddled with then either, and then this MSc in Missouri. Yeah,
so I went over there, so that was really good. It was a little bit strange to have a Kiwi in the Missouri program, because the Missouri Botanic program was basically driven by needs in the neotropics.
Right.
So all the South American countries, for example, had big programs from
neotropics,
Missouri.
That's just
the New World tropics,
just the South
American area, whereas the Old World tropics is Asia and parts of the Pacific, etc. So Missouri Botanic Gardens had this really strong program with the South American research institutes for training young people, students, MScs, PhDs.
Interesting.
So there was me there was a British guy and there was a Chinese guy in the program. And then there was about 20 South American Spanish-speaking people. So it was a really...
Must have been quite an eye-opener, though.
Oh, it was. I mean, it just opened my mind completely to systematics, evolutionary botany, evolutionary ecology, all that stuff.
And so different from New Zealand alpine flora.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, you can't get much different from New Zealand alpine flora to neotropical.
Yeah. And Missouri had a really strong program of... so the scientists, the researchers at the Botanic Garden were strongly linked with that program in terms of teaching.
Right.
And there's actually 4 universities in St. Louis, and the program was a joint program between the Botanic Garden and those 4 universities.
Oh, right.
So although I was at the University of Missouri, I was taking courses in 2 of the other universities as well.
Wow.
So you could pick and choose, and so it was a really, really good program. And then I came back from there, and I wanted to do a PhD straight away.
Right.
So I jumped into that at Canterbury University.
Right. And what was your PhD on?
It was on the taxonomy, classification and evolution of Carmachelia, the brooms.
Oh, beautiful. Carmachelia. Now let's talk about Carmachelia. They are one of my favourite genera, Carmachelia, the New Zealand native brooms, as you say there. But they're amazing. Tell us all about them.
Well, there were 4 genera, which was part of the focus of the study, and it was actually I was employed to do the PhD as a scientist.
Right.
So not full time on it because I had other responsibilities way back then as well. But principally, it was a taxonomic revision of Carmachelia, and the 3 segregate genera were Cordyspatium, Corallospatium, and Notospatium. So,
and you stuck them all together.
And I did in the end. The outcome of the study was that those other 3 genera were shown to be part of Carmachelia, and that there was, just understanding the evolution of the different growth habit, wood anatomy, floral morphology characters had gone in different directions depending on the sort of local environment, the habitat as a driver. Yeah.
When you were doing that PhD, were you revising the genus based on taxonomic, like, phenology that you can see, or were you already using DNA back then?
No, I was at that time, so I started that in about 94,
right? And
the first molecular systemitist we had at Landcare was Steve Wagstaff, and he joined from the US in 95.
Right.
So Steve had to set up the lab. And get everything running and become familiar with the flora, develop his own research program. And at that time, really, that type of DNA Sanger sequencing, where you're just sequencing like a region of 700 to 1,000 base pairs of a particular genetic marker.
Because we're talking sort of 30 years ago.
Yeah, well, that was in its infancy. It really was in its infancy.
And really expensive as well.
And very expensive.
Yeah,
so
and time-consuming, and get small bits of things. So you're relying mostly then on features of the plants that you can see, right? And the herbarium specimens. And
it was very much a traditional pre-molecular type of systematic study. Yeah. So, I mean, if you were doing it today, you would be, and in fact, supervising students who are doing various projects today. It's molecular and maybe something else, often not something else, predominantly molecular. Yeah. So it didn't have molecular work in those days. But
talk to us a bit about Carmachelia itself, because they are, like, for me, it's the smell. They're beautiful, but of course they don't tend to have massive leaves.
No, their leaves are basically reduced to leafless little scales, I guess, is what the correct word would be. So, but look, there was 2 levels of the study. There was the genus level study, resolving did we have 1, 2, 3 or 4 genera, and I settled on 1, and there's been really no debate about that for 30 years now since I made those changes.
So really a lumper rather than a splitter.
Look, I mean, it's a bit of a distracting comment in a way because I'm neither. Right. I mean, in some cases you do have to do lumping. In some cases you do splitting.
Depends what you start with, doesn't it?
It's what you see. It's what you start with, and it's what you see. And there's groups we've worked on, like when I published my Cardamine revision, which is a little crucifer herb. In 2017, there was about 35 new species in there.
Oh, right.
So, and we ended up with 45 altogether.
Wow.
So you could say I'm a splitter, but I'm not really, because that group had never been treated in the history of New Zealand botany.
Right.
So
you're starting from
nothing virtually, a very low level where names had been applied by the hookers in working in Kew from very scanty early New Zealand material that was collected. So, am I a splitter? I was in that case.
Yeah.
Am I a lumper? I am with Kamakila and other things I've done. So it's really having it sounds very simplistic and it just sounds like you're just having a look at the plants, but I do describe it as you study the plants, often in great detail.
Yeah.
But
and also putting them in context against what else is there, what their close relatives are, what the background of that whole family is, looking at the evolution. And it's not, I mean, it's you're doing it on all parts of the plant. So sometimes the part that you're describing is not the most obvious part of the plant. Like, I mean, if you look at Kamakila, sort of you're generally looking at kind of a leafless bush.
Yep.
But that's not the main, I guess, retained evolutionary parts of the plant. There you're describing it on, quite often it's the flower.
Yes, that's right. Look,
flower parts that you're using. And I mean, you can go into DNA, but when you're actually looking at the plants.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, the classifications as a taxonomist or a practicing systemitist that I am, you have to come up with something that's sensible for other people to use. So you can't be too obscure or too cryptic or too discreet about it. It has to be readily diagnosable characters that people can understand and interpret and apply their own. It's the plant in front of them that they have.
And backed up by where it sits within the family and the relationship with the other species.
Yes. Like if you look at Kamakila, there's all the species except one have small, highly coloured pink or lavender type flowers mostly, and they're pollinated by our solitary bees. So that works as a pollination mechanism. The flowers don't have to be big and showy because the bees aren't big and showy. They're small. So the flowers are small. The legume flowers characteristically have a flower structure that the insect can come in and has to trip the flower to affect the pollination. Right. So it's carrying pollen on its abdomen or its head from another flower, and it comes in to get the nectar from the flower it's visiting, and it will trip that flower, and that will make the pollen on the flower it's visiting accessible to be put onto the small solitary bee, and then that will fly to another flower. Right. So that's a sort of a co-evolutionary thing that's happened. But there's one species of Kamakila, Williamsii, which these days is predominantly on the northern offshore islands like the Poor Knights, for example.
Right. And is that because it's gone extinct in other places, or just because that's where it was?
It's a lot of the New Zealand flora. It's become extinct on the mainland. Habitat modification, browsing mammals, pest plants, all that. Some of the New Zealand flora hasn't coped that well with those pressures. Yeah. So its stronghold is on some of the offshore islands like the Poor Knights, the Aldermans, etc. But it has large yellow flowers, about 5 or 6, maybe 7 or 8 times the size of some of the smaller bee-pollinated flowers, and it's bird-pollinated. Right. So it's got a bird pollination syndrome of larger flowers. It's got floral guides on
what kind of birds is that? Is that Waxose tui?
No, it'll be stitch birds is probably the main one. So that was the main.
Unfortunately, they've also been very well hit by habitat loss and predominantly predators.
Yep. So on the Poor Knights, they're still there. And when I had a trip out there in '96, where we were really doing just some basic field observations. Right. But the stitch birds were clearly visiting the Williamsii and flower. But that's an example where you've got a very, very different flower, and you could just look at it and say, well, that's not like the other Kamakilias. It must be a different genus even. But it's not. It's part of the core Kamakila group. Yeah.
It's just got that little. Now, is that widely available if you wanted to plant it in your garden? Can you get it at nurseries?
Oh, yes, you can. Williamsii is one of the more commonly planted ones in garden centres, I guess.
I was just thinking because of the showy flowers, it seems to be
none of them are that common, and none of them are going to be, like the best plant of the year award type thing. But for a connoisseur of New Zealand plants or someone who wants something a little bit different, the Williamsii is, I think, quite an attractive garden plant.
I think they're gorgeous, eh?
But then I come from a very biased position.
I suppose, I suppose we do. But, they have a beautiful smell as well.
Yeah. Well, the smaller ones do, I mean, that's another thing. Williamsii is not really strongly scented.
Of course, because it's bird-pollinated.
It's bird-pollinated. Yeah. So it's really developed a whole lot of things in its floral morphology that are suited to the birds.
Yeah. And if you were going to plant that in your garden, what sort of conditions are you looking at?
Well, I think you should read Leonard Cockayne's little book and have a look and see what he says about it.
Right,
look, on the Poor Knights, it's interesting. It occupies sort of open semi-shaded or around the fringes of forest margins, habitat that's disturbed. Like if you think about the Poor Knights, the seabirds would have been dominant there in the past. So a really high level of disturbance in the understory, and you don't see that to the extent it would have been in the past. So the Kamakelias, generally speaking, are species that are colonisers of open disturbed habitat.
Right. So not underbush, not under canopy.
So not under canopy, but it grows fine in the open or in semi-shade or on the margins of a larger tree or trees you might have in your garden.
Yeah, and they are beautiful. I mean, they've got that sort of weeping kind of form, and they're just beautiful, beautiful bushes, trees. Yeah. Shrubs.
But the other thing about Kamakielia was that there was some species level problems.
Right.
And the main problem was around the widespread, what I ended up calling Kamakielia australis, which is the widespread shrubby species that we see throughout New Zealand. And its stems, or we call them cladodes because they're sort of leafless stems, so they can be called cladodes. Highly variable throughout New Zealand. So like around Dunedin here, for example, they might be green and 2 to 3 millimetres in diameter.
Yeah.
You go into central Otago, they're yellowy green, and they're way much stouter. They're probably 5, 6, 7 millimetres across, and they're pungent tipped, hard tipped.
Oh, right.
And like in the coastal areas, the plants will be soft tipped and a little bit flexible.
Right.
And then as you go north, they get wider and wider and wider until they might be like about 12 or 13 millimetres.
But still all the same species?
Well, they are. I did some morphometrics on that, and you could show that it was a cline throughout New Zealand, and it had the same map.
So it's just a gradual change over space, basically.
Over space. And the thing is that the flower morphology and the pods varied a little bit in their shape, but in their general morphology and the seeds, they were quite uniform.
So that must have been a lot of measuring of pods and leaves.
Yeah, it was a bit of a morphometric study. So it was, as part of the PhD, it was more of an exercise in doing morphometrics, and it happened to be a good example to use it on because it was widespread and polymorphic for those stem characters.
Yeah.
So,
but still able to hybridise right across that cline.
Yes, there was gene flow between different populations of that same species that were interconnected, effectively ensuring that there was continuity of, the species was connected to other populations of the same species of Australis. So that level of gene flow and environmental sort of drivers for that change, whatever I still don't really know what the driver was for the larger stems being up north. Could be temperature related, could be rainfall related. But it was a fairly. But
Kamakielia as a genus, quite endangered. Is it just a New Zealand Kamakielia?
No, there's one species on Lord Howe Island as well, Kamakielia
which technically is Australian.
So biogeographically, sort of probably part of New Zealand, but part of Australia in terms of its political boundaries.
I think we can count it as an endemic genus, though. Really,
yeah, it's pretty close.
Not the way, yeah.
So,
and some of them are quite threatened, quite endangered as
well.
So
there's the 23 species in New Zealand, and there's about 17 or 18 of them, I think, that are quite rare.
Right.
So, So my view of that is they're leafless.
Right.
So their leaves don't get desiccated in cold or hot, dry conditions. So I think they've lost them for one of those two reasons.
Yep.
Hard to tease apart what. But the really interesting thing is in their wood anatomy. Their wood anatomy, which I did do quite a bit of wood anatomy on them because it turned out to be quite interesting across the 4 genera and also from an ecological evolutionary sort of perspective as well. The wood is highly adapted to xeromorphic or dry conditions.
Right. So those sort of inland basins down here in the South Island.
Well,
and also I guess high alpine areas.
Well, that's looking at the landscape today, but I actually take a slightly different lens over it.
Okay.
I think that the reason we have 17, I can't remember if it's 17 or 18, one of the two threatened species today, and that's either nationally critical or at risk declining, is because we're in the middle of a warm interglacial. So if you look at the vegetation maps for New Zealand during glacial periods, we know that the trees were sort of north of the Cowrie line, sort of 38, 39 latitude.
Right.
And as you came further south, the trees dropped out, the shrubs dropped out. And at the height of the glacial periods down here in the southern South Island, for example, there was virtually no tree line. It was a shrubland, alpine, tussock grassland type habitat at very low elevation.
Right.
And so Kamakielia, I think, during the glacial periods would have been a dominant plant. It's a colonizer.
Yeah.
It fixes nitrogen. So on the
That's from being in the Fabaceae and that.
Yes,
that's legume.
so they fix their own nitrogen to enrich the soil nutrients, etc. So they're an early coloniser, so they're providing shelter, they're fixing nitrogen for later successional stages.
Yeah.
And you actually see that today. If you go to the west coast and look on glacial moraines over there's Camechelia odorata you often see out on the moraines. It's the first coloniser.
Right. And that odorata obviously referring to the beautiful smell.
The scent, that's right,
the scent.
So I think the reason a lot of them are quite rare is that they're on the back foot in a warm, relatively speaking, a warm interglacial period.
And of course with climate change we're just getting warmer, aren't we?
We're getting warmer and we're getting drier. But the other thing on the east coast we are anyway, but the other problem is for Camechelia being rare is that they're actually very poor competitors by and large.
Right, because they're rural early pioneers. That quite often goes hand in hand, doesn't it?
And so they're competing with thick, swarding, introduced exotic grasses by and large in those lowland habitats. So anyway, that's my view of why so many of them are on the back foot and quite rare.
Right.
It's just times change over millennia. Effectively.
Yeah. And I folks, I have to apologise here because, obviously we've had this discussion here, but I did tell Peter before the interview that I was going to talk about a group of genera, and I haven't mentioned any of them. I've completely diverged after the Camechelia. But I do love Camechelia. It's one of my favourite. It is one of my favourite genera.
Well, it's probably worthy of a bit of discussion because it's the one I did cut my teeth on as a taxonomist.
It is fabulous. And then, of course, so that was your PhD. And then, of course, you came back to Manaaki Whenua land care research.
Well, I was always there anyway.
And came back from Missouri to the physical land of New Zealand.
Yes, that's right. Did the PhD, did the Camechelia revision, and then became, like a scientist in the program fundamentally.
Yeah. So and then you've, I guess, from there, it was the botany division of DSIR, and then it's kind of got split up into the CRIs, obviously, and you've stayed with the land care research plant part of it. I guess you could have gone to Scion, couldn't you?
Possibly, but my home was,
your home is really taxonomy
with the botany division.
The botany division.
What that became, so that was around the Allan Herbarium.
And you're currently the director of the Allan Museum.
Yeah, the Allan Herbarium, So
Allan Museum
Herbarium. I am the director, but some of it's only in title because I've got a really, really good curator, Ines Schomburger, and she effectively runs the herbarium, and I sort of provide the policy, strategy, direction, oversight. But
you were the actual curator.
But I was the curator.
It's not like you got parachuted in as the director.
No.
You've worked your way up through.
Well, what happened was we had unfortunately there was a round of restructuring and redundancies in 1999 in Landcare. And so there were two people who were involved in the herbarium and the databases at the time, and they had to move on. And so it needed a new management. So there was actually three of us came in at the time. We had Ilse Brettweiser, who was the OBI at the time, or senior research leader. And then I came in as curator, and another colleague, Aaron Wilton, who had a really strong interest in databases and informatics, came in and looked after the databases. So I did that role for about 3 years, but it created a lot of conflicts for me because I fundamentally wanted to be a scientist, and I was far too distracted into management. And so Ilse, myself and Aaron, we agreed that Aaron would take over being curator. So he did that, and I relinquished that, and I went back to doing science. And I guess one of the tasks there was sort of seeking additional funding. So we can all roll our eyes on that one because it's our bread and butter these days. We have to, that's a key part of being a scientist in New Zealand. You have to face up to that reality that there's often not enough money to go around, and you have to be looking at ways to support yourself and your colleagues. Yeah,
and I thought maybe we just spend a couple of minutes just talking about the herbarium. Te kohina, tipu, or Aotearoa. And of course, tipu is plants. So, and the herbarium, it's very old, the Allan Herbarium, right? So it's...
Yeah, so the first specimens... so DSIR started, Botany Division was founded in 1928. And that's when the herbarium started with H. Allan, the author of Volume 1 of the New Zealand Flora.
So that's almost up to its centennial.
Yeah, well, I was talking to some of the Royal Society people last night saying, do you realise that one of the DSIR divisions It's going to be, even though they're gone now and morphed into something else, but we value that history and that legacy.
And the herbarium itself is still there, and specimens that Allan will have collected almost 100 years ago. And I just wondered, a lot of people haven't had the opportunity to go into that herbarium and see, and they wouldn't have the idea of how useful it is.
Yep.
And it's still like a living resource.
Well, it's almost becoming more living than it has been in the past in many respects, because we have a big digitisation initiative at the moment. So we're taking photographs, high quality, of every specimen is the intention.
Yeah. So when you're talking about a specimen, you've got a sheet that someone's prepared, and you've got the pressed plants, and they've gone out and collected them from somewhere, pressed them, sometimes in the field, and then arranged them prettily on the paper. But they do try and collect all the parts.
Yes, that's the intention.
That's the intention always. And of course it's always got the label, so it's got the provenance, where it was from, when it was collected, who collected it, as much information about the location, and sometimes they've got habitat, on a shady rock or something written in the comments there. So all of that makes them very useful.
And look, if that information, and that's the goal, all that information is on the sheet, then that's good. And often for where that plant came from, it's no longer there today. Those populations are gone. It's housing, it's farmland. So it's a insight into what was there in the past. So we've currently got about 800,000 items in the collection. So that was started in 1928. Yeah. And that's what.
And still actively collecting.
So we are adding between 5,000 and 7,000 or 8,000 specimens a year. It just fluctuates a little bit. Our systematic staff, most of our research is like genera focused. So when I'm working on cardamine, I'm collecting cardamine. Right. But when I go in the field to collect, say, cardamine like I was, I'm not just collecting cardamine, I'm collecting other things as well. Right. So the science staff in the herbarium, who are the scientists doing the revisions of the New Zealand plants, we are adding to the collection regularly. But we have a big strong relationship with DOC Tier 1 monitoring, which is the carbon monitoring program in New Zealand. Right. And
that's been going for several years now.
It's been going for a long time now. But one of the connection there is that they are vouchering what is in their plots. Right. So that includes
when they're vouchering them, they're taking a specimen.
They're recording all the information you described for the label, and they're giving us all of that in the herbarium.
So if it does change, so if someone revises that genus, it can all be updated, and you actually know what was there because you've got a sample of it that you can refer back to.
And those specimens in that the plot monitoring program, there's a lot of other benefits scientifically out of that work as well, in terms of what's the carbon sequestration of the forests, and what's the change in terms of ecosystem processes. Earthquakes causing landslides, and if you have a plot that happens to be hit by a landslide, then you can see what happens in that context. Yeah. So there's a lot of multi uses for that type of data. So the National Vegetation Survey is actually where the plot monitoring data sits. That's another Landcare database system. But we now have these specimens that are collected, and that includes the flowering plants as well as the bryophytes, lichens, and lichens to a lesser extent, but liverworts and mosses in particular,
and hornworts, I guess,
and hornworts as well,
and all the ferns and everything.
And the ferns, the vascular plants are all covered. So that's a really highly valuable and really good connection. And DOC have come to the party on that one for us, which is a really healthy relationship, in that we often have some of the people who are involved in the Tier 1 plot monitoring, or slightly a level up in the DOC management system, coming and spending 1 or 2 days a week at the herbarium, processing that material for us. Oh, right. And then we have all the mounting and the digitisation of it that we do. So it's sort of a joint project with.
Because there's a lot of work in just getting those specimens ready to be lodged.
It's a massive amount of work. And so the thing is that databasing in the Allan Herbarium really only started in about the mid-1980s or early 1980s. So anything that was pre that has generally not been databased, or it's been databased when...
So you're on a big catch-up mission now to get all those older samples.
Yeah, not all of them, because some of them have been databased where there's a request for it from someone in New Zealand or that wants to work on them and wants that data available electronically, or one of our staff is working on that group or that family. We will get them databased, but we do have this big digitisation project now where we're looking to image, the bulk of our material, and associated with that imaging, obviously, is making the label information available.
Searchable database
is available as well.
Yeah.
So, like the herbarium in that context is like dead plants coming to life in a way.
And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the connection between that and when you're revising a genus or a family, or looking at whether one species is one species or multiple species across a cline. Because like you were talking about with the cline with Kalmakilia before, if you've got a species that is a cline over a large geographical space, but it then goes extinct because of introduced pests or land management or whatever in the middle of that, you can really easily look like you've got two very different species.
Yep. So we have to take all that sort of stuff into account when we're doing our work.
Yeah, and I guess the herbarium, the historical specimens
shed light on that.
Shed some light.
Look,
on
I
that.
think there has been a massive loss of vegetation in the lowlands with what we talked about before, with the conversion to urbanisation and farming practices. But there's still a lot of remnants, and New Zealand's a small country at the end of the day, relatively speaking, and the coverage is actually pretty high.
Yeah.
And it might not be total coverage with just the herbarium collections, but we frequently use some of these other databases like the NIVS, which has,
the National Vegetation Survey.
National Vegetation Survey. It has plant distributional records, so we can lean on that.
Yeah.
And another big changer of the last few years, of course, is iNaturalist.
Yeah.
So I've actually written at least one, maybe two papers, certainly one, where I've leaned heavily on iNaturalist records.
And that's a fantastic resource. We will put the link to that in the episode description here, because that's something where anyone can take a picture of something to try and get a good picture, right? So you want a clear image, you want, if you can, get multiple parts like the leaf structure and the flower structure all in the same plant. So a hint's there for people.
Yeah, look, so iNaturalist, for those that don't know it, is a citizen science photographic sort of global platform where you can take photographs and load them up. And just to give you an example, I worked on oh gosh, the genus just escapes me now. New Zealand coastal spinach, and there was a problem with if we got the same species as in Australia, or is it different? And I concluded that it was different. And so, but if I looked at the herbarium material I had available to me in New Zealand, I think I had about 100 specimens that I could use. But when I went to iNaturalist, there were like 1,200 photographs.
Oh, wow.
So it filled in the distributional range. Another really good example with that extra data we can get is some of the distributional modelling we've done on the native flora. Take silver beech, for example, Lophozonia.
Yeah.
Which
used to be Nothofagus, folks.
Yes, and I'm responsible for that with another colleague about changing the name of our beeches.
Yeah, we'll get back to that.
So, but if we look at, say, silver beech records in the herbarium, we might have 100 or 120. But when we use the National Vegetation Survey data for this modelling...
And of course there are other herbaria as well.
There's other herbaria.
There's Papa and the Otago herbarium.
So they're all linked through the New Zealand National Herbarium Network, and a lot of those other collections are also databased, so you can access the georeference material.
Yeah.
So what I was going to say was, if you add all that up for silver beech, there's about 120 maybe georeferenced records in the herbaria. You look on the National Vegetation Survey database and you've got 10,000.
Yeah.
So, for some types of studies that I get involved with that aren't really core systematics, you're drawing on these other databases to, put more dots on a map, basically. And you scale it up for the entire flora, it becomes quite powerful.
Yeah. Yep. Heading back to Nothofagus.
Yes.
Because it's a big, important tree in the New Zealand ecosystem. It was Nothofagus. Well, it was Fagus for a long time as well, with just those, European botanists coming down and saying this fits the niche of a Fagus, of a beech tree. We're going to call them all common names beech trees. Of course, they did have te reo Māori names prior to that because they were all big, obvious trees.
Yep.
Let's call them all Fagus. And then they got to Nothofagus, referencing the southern distribution of them. What drew you?
So the thing about the beeches globally and in New Zealand is that there's very distinct groups. So these groups are well defined by their morphology, both their leaf morphology, Their flower morphology is also very distinct. Their pollen morphology in terms of the flowers is very diagnostic. So the palynologist, for example, can identify pollen, fossil pollen, to which one of the groups of species it belongs to.
And silver beech has always in the pollen fossil of New Zealand been like you'll see it in lots of papers. There's silver beech, other beeches.
Yeah, but the other beeches are generally the Fuscospora type.
Yeah.
So, but you see, the other thing is as well, if you look at the pollen types, and it's been well characterised, they're pollen types that are equivalent to the living beeches of today that are extinct, that probably represent other taxonomic groups that have been here in the past and gone extinct.
Right.
This is going back like 80 to 100 million years, so we're talking quite deep ages here.
Yeah.
But so when we looked at this morphological data that I just described, there's a lot of genetic data globally available because the southern beeches, because they're in South America, New Zealand, Australia, there's a Brassispora group that, or we called it Trisyngine as the genus name, that's up into New Caledonia and New Guinea. That has a very different pollen type as well. So they're a southern hemisphere group, so they've been well studied and well characterised genetically. So when we took the plant sort of the leaf, the flower, the growth habit, the pollen morphology, the distributional range, the genetic data, but there's some other bits of data as well. Those different groups of beech, southern beeches, they also have different relationships with different fungi,
right?
And they also have different relationships with other insects.
Right.
So these relationships of these insects and the fungi are quite specific to one of those groups or two of those groups maybe. So there's a whole lot of characters that define them as distinct groups. Now, in terms of our classification, if you look at the Fagaceae, which is the family that the beeches belong to,
that both the northern hemisphere and the
southern hemisphere ones, and you look at what taxonomists around the world have done with other genera in the Fagaceae family, we needed to apply that to the Nothofagus group to be consistent within the family.
Right.
And so some of that was around genetic divergence and sequence divergence, for example, with the genetic data. That was a key driver. And when you looked at all of this together, the argument for us was to recognise the beeches, the four groups of beech that are alive today, as different genera. And that mirrors the global pattern for the family of taxonomic recognition.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, it's almost a 50-50 call in some people's minds of what you want to apply. So some people will call them Nothofagus subgenus, and there's four subgenera.
Right.
So we basically took the subgenera and moved them up to genera.
Right. And I think, even when I was doing botany, there was always this distinction that silver beech was more different to, hard beech and black beech and mountain beech and then red beech. So there was always some, even while they were all in Nothofagus, there was always a recognition amongst botanists that there was a bigger distinction between some of those species than others.
Yeah, and look, there's a few sort of semantic arguments about how you apply a classification like that, and we took one side of those to recognise four genera. Other people will take another view and say, we're just going to call them subgenera. Yeah. But the really interesting thing is when the people, particularly the palynologists, write on them as subgenera, they drop the Nothofagus subgenus Fuscospora, and in their writings they just call them Fuscospora, like they're a genus. So there's some inconsistencies there about, anyway, it hasn't gone down. It's turning out to be a very well cited paper, our paper. That's because half the people citing it don't like it.
Well, do you know what I think? I think there's quite a lot of just botanists and ecologists that are just kind of attached to the nomenclature that was there when they first became a botanist.
The palynologists are certainly in that camp. And
because they've just called it that all their working life.
That's right. And also their collections reflect that. So we acknowledge that as well. And so it is a bit problematic, but we're trying to be objective across the family and the other genera in the family and how you should treat them here.
And of course it also reflects the relationships with other species in South America and Australia as well, and and possibly better reflects those relationships now with the elevation to the four. Well,
we certainly think they do. Yeah, so anyway, it's a debatable ongoing point, and that's what science is about,
Yeah. And that's high controversy for the botanical field, isn't it?
Yep.
But Hey, we've only got a couple of minutes left now, Peter, but I did think I would just come right back to the research awards and Leonard Cockayne and, the greatness and how you feel about having this award. But I thought one thing that was at the Research Awards last night, and just congratulations again on it, and I think that just from this discussion people out there can hear why you personally have been awarded this, and also I guess it's a reflection on the team that you work with as well, as much as anything. But what was fantastic last night was to have the MC kind of serenade, would you say, with the poem from the poet laureate.
Yep.
Actually, to every of the award winners have a poem written for you. Have you ever had a poem written
No, I haven't.
Before?
And that was pretty special for the 5 of us that got awards last night. So that was really, really good, actually. And as she said herself, there's the Auckland Awards coming up where there's going to be 10 recipients. She said she's not writing 10 poems.
Right.
So we got pretty lucky here in Dunedin with the 5 of us each having a poem. So, that was a really nice personal touch from her. And, look, she was a great MC. She was really outstanding. And she set the tone for the night, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Hey, and where to from here?
So I guess at the moment, funding for science in New Zealand is a bit problematic. The signals from the government, no more money. If you want to, do things different or do other things, you've got to move the deck chairs around, so to speak. So I've had opportunities for many years to work up in the Pacific on different projects. And I've currently, or about 18 months ago, I decided to shift some of my work into the Pacific to support an MFAT, New Zealand Government MFAT, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade initiative up in the Pacific around food security and climate change. So, but in parallel with doing that work, I've also been developing biodiversity interests up there. And so I've got quite a few projects with the Niuean government, which have sort of had seed money at the moment from Landcare, some money from them and some money from another grant. But the biodiversity needs up in the Pacific region, and I'm thinking of like Niue, Tonga, Samoa in particular. We've got other work in Vanuatu, the Cooks as well. But in some of those countries, especially the first little group I mentioned, like their floras for Niue, 1943 and 1970.
Yes.
They've got 2 floras, that's it. And they're not complete. They've never been updated. They're very brief style floras. So there's an enormous amount of work to do in the Pacific. You compare the herbarium collections, and we were talking about hundreds before. We're talking about single digits for most of the species from any of these countries captured.
And just trying to work out what was there, what is there, how it's related to things, all of that is important work. Is really the basis for any conservation work that follows it or any ecological work. And I think that's one of the really important things about taxonomy. As I spent most of my research life as a quantitative ecologist, and we rely very heavily on all of that taxonomic data, because if you haven't got a flora, if you can't identify things, you don't know where it's that's the foundation. So I think it's one thing that's really great about this Leonard Cockayne Award is that it really is recognising botanists, and it is an opportunity to recognise the work that taxonomists and systematists like yourself do, and quite often goes a little bit unnoticed. Just a little bit goes...
Yeah, people might use our names for the plants that we give them, but they don't necessarily see where that comes from or what sits behind it. So, but look, I haven't given up on the New Zealand flora. It's just that we're in a little bit of a trough, and how we can secure money to keep doing some of that work is challenging. But the opportunities for me as a individually as a scientist, there's good opportunities in the Pacific to make a contribution up there. The people are great to work with. The climate's great. And the biodiversity issues, as you just alluded to, are critical. And weed invasions are problematic.
Species,
weeds,
climate change is going to hit massively in some of those Pacific islands there.
So look, I'm quite excited about that for the next few years, in the short term anyway, of working up there and seeing what we can do to help with their situation. And it's driven by their needs. We're not going up there to tell them how to do something. I mean,
it's a whole different way of research now to what it was 100 years ago. So you're really, working with the people on the ground.
We're working with the Indigenous people up there, in every country. They're driving it, and we are walking beside them giving a science perspective.
Yeah. Hey, thank you very much for joining us in the studio here.
Oh, it's been great.
Peter, congratulations on your award and good luck with the future research.
Yeah, good. Thanks very much, Barb. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Ka kite. You've been listening to the OI podcast, the shout out for the arts, sciences and Mataranga Māori.
You can support this podcast by becoming a member of the OI. Check out the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences on Facebook or our website.
If you'd like to listen again to this episode or others from the series, look for the OI podcast on OAR FM's website, oar.org.nz.
Brought to you by the Otago Institute for Arts and Sciences, the Otago branch of the Royal Society of New Zealand.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.